Hello and welcome to Social Science Weekly, where we take the most important social science papers, giving you just the facts and none of the spin. The paper we're looking at today is called simply Identity Politics, and this is currently an economics working paper, which means that it has not yet gone through the proper peer review process. And there are two authors on this paper, and they are Nicola Geniali and Guido Tabellini, and both authors are at Bocconi University in Italy. Okay, let's get started. So in Western countries, many people have noticed the emergence of a so-called culture war, i.e. people are now increasingly making their political decisions based on their identity rather than sort of universal factors like, economic policy. And this is what the authors decided to investigate, focusing on the United States. They asked to what extent American voters are now identifying with those identity politics groups rather than universal ideals like class or belonging to a political party. And this has led to a change in the parties that people vote for, or this is the question they ask. They also ask, does being working class matter as much as it did before in terms of the political parties that people in the United States vote for? And they explored these questions and more. Okay, so now let's explore what the data can tell us and what it cannot tell us. The primary data the authors used in this paper was a survey they conducted in February and March 2022, which covered around 3,000 people in the United States. And the authors wanted to ensure that their sample was representative of the US population, so they balanced it by age, race, gender, religion, education, and income. So even though they made these efforts, there were a few mismatches in their sample compared to the population of the United States. So the author's sample had too many individuals that were poor, too many that were white, too many that were female, and too many that were less educated, and also Hispanics were slightly underrepresented. The survey asked participants which groups they identify with. So they asked whether the respondents identify with certain non-identity politics groups like a political party, Republican or Democrat, or a particular class, like are you working class or are you upper class? And then they asked if the respondents identify with a series of progressive and conservative identity politics groups. So the conservative identity politics groups they asked about were, are you a Protestant or Catholic Christian? Do you identify with the white race? Do you identify with your local community, or do you identify with cultural traditions? And then the progressive identity politics groups were, are you secular? Do you identify with the black race? Are you a citizen of the world? Or do you identify with progressive culture? And then they also inquired about past identifications, asking the participants to recall whether they identified as something else in the past. And this meant that they could compare people's current group IDs with their past ones. However, this approach has some limitations in that it relies on the participants accurately recalling what they might have believed and how they identified in the past. The other thing that the survey looked at was asking about the people's policy preferences and their beliefs about both cultural and economic issues. They created indicators for these four variables by combining responses from multiple questions in the survey using principal component analysis. So to take lots of questions and compress them down into these four variables. This method essentially extracts all that shared information that exists across all those different survey questions and compresses it down to a single number. However, it becomes a bit challenging when you do this to discern the specific meaning of the indicator, as it now amalgamates various survey questions in kind of a slightly hard to understand way. The economic policy views indicator, the questions that went into that were questions about people's attitudes towards government services, the government's role in providing jobs, adequate standards of living, and taxation. And the economic belief index asked about what people believed about the state of economic inequality and social mobility in the United States. When they asked about people's cultural policy views, those questions were about things like abortion, immigration, affirmative action. And lastly, when they asked about what people believed about the cultural world, the questions that went into that were what people believed about wage and education disparities in terms of race, and then also things about immigration and crime, and then also how many abortions they believed were conducted annually in the United States. But that wasn't the survey that they conducted, wasn't the only source that they looked at. They also looked at they also wanted to look at the kind of rhetoric around congressional speeches and adverts, political adverts. So what they did was they characterized each politician's moral viewpoint by counting all the words in the speeches that they gave in the House of Representatives in the United States. And they did this, and then they used those words to define something called to essentially see if the moral stance in the speeches were were kind of universal moral standpoints, or whether they were more kind of whether they were less universal. And they did this by kind of just searching for keywords in that vast amount of text. And they use this data to assess the politicians' views between the years 2000 and 2016, just to see how, for both Republican and Democrat members of Congress, how sort of universal their moral speech is. And then on top of that data from the speeches from Congress, they looked at political ads run by the Democrat and the Republican Party, using data from the Wesleyan Media Project, which I've actually linked to in the show notes. And essentially what they did here was, in a similar way, they counted words in the transcripts of these ads and categorized the ad into whether it's about a universal issue like economics, taxes, jobs, that kind of thing, or whether the advert was about cultural issues, things like immigration or abortion. And then finally, the last set of data that I'm going to talk about that the authors used was looking at how the white population in the United States, how their political behavior and voting patterns have changed. So they use survey data from the American National Election Study, which I've linked to in the show notes. And what this survey is it's polled a random cross-section of the US population to ask about their voting choices during each presidential election year since 1996. And they also, at the same time as gathering information on how these people voted, they also gathered other data on the income and education of those participants. So there are actually lots of other results in this paper, but I'm just not going to have time to talk about them. So I've decided just to focus on the survey, mostly on the survey data they collected because it's new. and novel data, rather than talking about like the entirety of the findings, which I think would just take too long in this case. Okay, so now on to the findings. The first finding reveals that over recent decades, both the content of political speeches and the content of political advertisements have shifted towards more cultural issues and away from more universal issues like economics. And this shift has been more pronounced for Republicans than for Democrats. The second finding shows that since 1996 in the United States, the political parties that white people vote for has changed. So poorer white individuals are now more likely to vote for the conservative Republican Party, while wealthier individuals lean towards the Democrat Party. Similarly, highly educated white individuals tend to vote Democrat now, whereas less educated folks lean Republican. And this is actually a reversal of the patterns that we saw in the 1990s, where it was the other way around. The third finding reveals that around 2/3 of respondents primarily identify with some kind of identity politics group, with a few identifying based on class. The most common identity for conservatives was their religion, whereas for progressives it was identifying as a citizen of the world. The fourth finding indicates that individuals who previously identified based on class or political party have actually now transitioned to some identity politics group. Whereas conversely, those who previously identified with some identity politics group haven't made the opposite switch. One interesting thing about this swapping is that individuals who once identified as working class have tended to shift more towards a conservative identity politics identity rather than a progressive one, although this is not totally clear cut. The fifth finding establishes that there's actually no correlation between class identity and voting behavior in 2022 in the survey data. However, what they did establish was that those who identify with conservative identity politics groups tend to vote Republican, and those who identify with progressive identity politics groups tend to vote for the Democrats. But again, class identity didn't have anywhere near the same effect. The sixth finding shows that individuals from identity politics groups have more pronounced disagreements about economic policies and cultural policies. But again, those who identify based on class have mixed views on both cultural and economic policies. There's no big divide between the rich and the poor in terms of class, working class, upper class, but there is in terms of progressive identity politics and conservative identity politics. And the final finding suggests that individuals from conservative identity politics groups are more inclined to attribute economic hardships to globalization and new technology when compared to progressive identity politics groups that are less likely to attribute economic hardships to globalization and new technology. Okay, so that's all the findings, so let's wrap up. The authors investigated the rise of identity politics in the United States, focusing on whether Americans are now making political decisions based on identity rather than traditional factors like class. So using a 2022 survey of 3,000 US subjects, they found that 2/3 of the respondents primarily identify with identity politics groups. They also showed that political speeches and advertisements have become more culturally focused, especially for Republicans. Voting patterns among white Americans have shifted since 1996, with poorer and less educated individuals leaning Republican, while richer and more educated individuals lean Democrat. Interestingly, class identity doesn't correlate with voting behavior, but identity politics does, with conservatives leaning Republican and progressives leaning Democrat. And all of this suggests that identity politics, rather than class, is becoming a significant factor in political behavior in the United States. Okay, we will provide a link to the paper and other interesting resources in the description below. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. It really helps us out. It means that we can make more of these videos. And to keep up to date with Social Science Weekly, you can get us on Twitter and you can get us on LinkedIn. So that's it for Social Science Weekly, bringing you just the facts, none of the spin, from the best and most important social science.